American Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel once said, "I do not believe any civilized society should be at the service of death. I do not think it's human to become an agent of the angel of death." Capital punishment has long been a controversial issue worldwide, especially in the United States. There are hundreds of arguments both for and against capital punishment. However, I will be covering what I believe is to be the most important arguments against the death penalty. Throughout this speech, I will provide you with statistics, testimonials, and other compelling evidence against capital punishment, and how it is in fact an ineffective way to discourage, and it is morally unacceptable. There are numerous reasons why the death penalty should no longer be practiced. The first major concern of capital punishments is the opponents of racism and poverty. Racism regarding death penalty cases is too bold to ignore. Currently on death row, 45% of inmates are white, 42% of inmates are black, and 11% are Latino. This is severely disproportionate to our population, as African Americans only make up 12% of the United States. In addition, studies has also found a black individual is 3.5 times more likely to receive a death penalty if a crime involved a white victim. 80% of capital cases involve white victims, despite only 50% of the murder victims are white nationally. In a study reviewing race and the death penalty, 96% of states were demonstrated being guilty of race of victim or race of defendant discrimination. These percentages are hard not to argue when only 15 white persons have been executed for murdering African Americans, whereas 242 black defendants have been executed for murdering a white person since 1976. Other than the issue of race, poverty is also a distressing reason why the death penalty should be abolished. 90% of defendants were too poor to hire an attorney. Oftentimes, attorneys assigned a capital punishment case are not always trained to handle them. They're emotional and difficult cases, and sometimes the attorneys are often linked to the judges as well. The wealthy who are able to hire their own attorneys are many more times more likely to avoid the death penalty compared to the poor. Take, for instance, the case of George McFarland from Texas, who was on death row for the death of a shopkeeper who was robbed and shot to death. There was no forensic evidence or confession linking McFarland to the death, but he was picked out from a lineup from a woman who really didn't get a good look at the killer. McFarland was given 2 attorneys, one who's never experienced a death row case before, and the second who was 74 years old. They only prepared for the case 4 hours before McFarland actually went on trial, and only 3 of the 14 witnesses were cross-examined. The head attorney, the 74-year-old, slept through many integral points in the trial, so now McFarland has been on death row for 10 years. A man is sentenced to lose his life because a woman didn't quite get a good look at the killer and a sleeping 74-year-old attorney. While this case is unsettling to say the least, it is more unsettling to know the frequency at which these mishandlings of capital cases occur. This leads to my third point, the possibility of innocence. There is no doubt in my mind that there have been many innocent men and women out of the 1,277 that have been executed since 1976. Since 1973, there have been 139 false convictions of death row inmates, and the rate has increased from 3 to 5 years since 2000 due to improvements in forensics and crime scene technology. For instance, Governor George Ryan declared temporary suspension of the death penalty in the state of Illinois in 2000. The case has received attention from the public from when death row inmate Anthony Porter, who had spent 15 years on death row, was within 2 days of being executed when his lawyers wanted to stay on the grounds that he may be mentally challenged. With help from Northwestern University, his charges were dropped and he was released in 1999. Shortly after, another person confessed and pleaded guilty to the same crime Porter has been wrongly convicted of for those past 15 years. After this case, Governor Ryan commuted all of the 167 of the state's death row inmates to life sentences on the grounds that the death penalty could not be administered fairly. At the rate of 5 false convictions a year, it is safe to say that the margin of error in the death penalty puts our system at great risk of executing hundreds of wrongly convicted, totally innocent people. Finally, those who support the idea of the death penalty often argue that certain crimes are so violent and have such disregard to the victims' human rights that they have in turn forfeited their own victims, and a victim's family should take from the killer what they've taken from them. While this argument does seem logical, many of those who witness an execution remark that it does not leave them at rest or give them closure. There are also many organizations comprised of parents, children, spouses, cousins, and friends of the victims of the murder, such as the murderers' victims' families, for reconciliation, that are working with the policymakers to abolish the death penalty. Furthermore, proponents of the death penalty argue that the death penalty is a deterrent of crime and less expensive for taxpayers than a life sentence. However, statistics show that there is no evidence supporting a decrease in crime due to the death penalty. In fact, the crime rates are actually lower among the 15 states without it, and a pool of police chiefs found that it was ranked last in the ways to reduce violent crimes and was the least efficient way to spend the tax spenders' dollars. On average, a death penalty case costs 3 times as much as a life sentence in a maximum security prison due to the costs and appeals it takes to override the death penalty. During this difficult economic period, can we afford to spend hundreds of millions of tax dollars on executions? The death penalty is certainly a multifaceted issue. It is certainly not easy to say that a serial killer who preys on small children or a rapist who tortures his victims has any rights to his or her own life. I also do struggle placing myself in the position of a family member or friend of a murdered victim, which possibly my viewpoint could change. However, I believe in the United States the death penalty is unconstitutional under the 8th Amendment regarding cruel and unusual punishment. And a life sentence without parole is far more of a punishment than the death penalty. Who are we to decide who lives and dies, regardless of what an individual has done? How does that make us any better than them? The death penalty will continue to be a controversial subject until the government can realize that the use of capital punishment is simply something our nation can do without.